All right, well, we've got the sort of 5-minute mark there, so I will begin introducing the session. So as I mentioned earlier, Knox, I'm a colleague of James's at the University of Vienna. I'll be moderating this first keynote today. A note on questions and comments at the end. I'm happy to, for those of you who may be having technical difficulties or Wi-Fi issues, I have the chat open here, so if you have questions that you're unable to share over video, please feel free to put those in the chat as well, just so that they can be covered there. The introduction of our first speaker may be somewhat redundant, having just proceeded through the introductory session of the conference, but I will proceed to introduce Claudia Baldassi again as it is. Claudia holds as she mentioned in the introduction, as a classicist and holds a PhD from the University of Edinburgh, and also works currently as a game designer at Paradox Interactive, where she's worked on Rome, Imperator Rome, and now CK3. And her talk today will be is titled, as you can see on the screen, "The Quest for a Medieval World in Modern Video Games." So with that brief introduction handled, I will now hand over to Claudia to begin her discussion. Thank you.
Thank you very much for this important introduction. And hello and welcome to everybody. It is a great pleasure for me to open the proceedings of this well-needed workshop, for which I'd like to thank the organizers wholeheartedly. I think that the topic is going to be particularly relevant to all parties involved, but unfortunately it has been pushed to the margins of the debate for too long. So historical connections inside video games, connections with history outside video games. While the representation of history through modern media has been the object of some mild interest from scholars for decades, it is only in recent years that academia has started considering video games as an entity worthy of studying, but mainly from a passive, descriptive point of view, while open and constructive dialogue is still rarely considered. Well, I was counting on saying some words about myself before really starting, but I think that most of the things have already been said. So I started my career at the University of Torino, crowned my studies with a PhD at the University of Edinburgh, so had a pretty standard academic career. But despite the best efforts of my universities, professors, and most peers, I never lost that nerdy side that made me spend most of my free time playing video games, mostly strategy and RPGs. So when the time came, I applied to my favorite strategy games company as a sort of a gamble. They'll never take someone with my background, I told myself, but if they do, there's no question. I'm packing my stuff and going without looking back. And that's what happened. In the past year and a half, I've worked on the latest phases of Imperator Rome, and more recently on Crusader Kings 3. It should not be a surprise then that I found the topic of this workshop incredibly relevant to my experience, having known the best or the worst of both worlds, but also with it being a topic that is constantly in our minds at Paradox. In case someone does not recognize the name, Paradox Interactive are the inventors and world leaders in the genre of grand strategy games. This genre is easier to play than to explain, and it's notoriously not that easy to play either. Still, we can sum it up as a map-based hybrid approach between turn and real-time, focus on simulation, complexity, depth of management, and the historical and geographical wide scope. The successful series of Europa Universalis, Victoria, Crusader Kings, and Heart of Irons are among our titles. Recently published Crusader Kings 3 is a crown jewel of sorts. While not the most played or famous on the list, it has had the most successful launch and the highest ratings out of all of our games. It is also very convenient that it is very relevant to today's topic. Not only does it take place in the Middle Ages, but it's also a game about people and their relations, not just about countries like the other games. What does this mean from a practical point of view? I would like to dedicate the first part of my intervention to discuss some relevant aspects of the game concerning the concept of medieval social networks and connections before gradually moving into some open questions on the advantages and limitations of the video game as a means to reproduce history. So as a follow-up in the second part, I'd like to share some experiences from Paradox Interactive to facilitate the discussion on how game developers interact with history and how academic historians could and should fit in the picture. In Crusader Kings, the player takes control of a character deeply embedded in a political and social system in a way that very few other games ever did. And this brings us to one of the main topics of the workshop. Humans live by nature in societies, which are incredibly complex networks of people. We have no reason to believe that medieval networks were any less complex than contemporary ones. So how can a game reproduce this reality? An easy answer would be, well, it can't. But it is also a profoundly dissatisfying answer. So CK3, if you allow me this shortening from this point onward, didn't shy away from the challenge, winning many successes, leaving a lot more still to do, and facing many limitations of the means itself. How does CK3 create good networks of people then? First of all, characters are aware that the rest of the world is populated by other people, and everyone has an opinion of everyone else based on what they know of them, their respective personality, culture, religion. It's natural. Everyone judges others based on their interactions and their reputation. If a Viking lord dislikes Christians, he doesn't need to know a Christian king personally to dislike him based on his religion. However, he won't be able to interact with him if he is outside of his diplomatic range, representing how far one's knowledge of the world, everyday interactions, political interests, and actual material possibilities would reach. Both opinion and diplomatic range are mathematical values in game, so a gamified simplification of much more complex real-life ideas. But in their simplified form, they allow the player to feel like they are part of an alive and somehow realistic world. Another aspect that allows CK3's personal networks to shine is politics. Compared to more formalized diplomacy of later eras, medieval politics is very much a personal business among individual leaders. In CK, political weddings are the rule and are the only way to secure an alliance with another ruler. Similarly, friendly interactions with other rulers are an excellent way to promote peace, but betrayal is always around the corner. And again, it is a ruler's choice, depending on their personality and infringing on their own reputation. However, a medieval ruler does not interact exclusively with their foreign peers, but also with a net of vassals, sometimes loyal, sometimes jealous, and ambitious. Hostile factions are formed by individuals around individuals to protect one's own individual interests. Behind the scenes, instead, plotters seduce and assassinate their way up to power. Around the ruler, courts are populated by family members, friends, lovers, rivals, wards, prisoners, counselors, holders of good positions, and wandering guests, each with their opinions of each other, their families, their connections, their ambitions, to create a colorful mosaic of human experiences. While we haven't gotten around to making a proper trade system yet, so that's definitely a topic I'm looking forward talking about later on, characters, artists, and intellectuals, a broad definition of what we have recently called inspired characters in game, do travel between realms through a complex setup system. On the topic of wandering guests, I'd like to quote our director, Alexander Oltner, who wanted interesting characters to stay interesting. Instead of having a deposed king go to someone's court only to grow old and die and disappear basically without no one knowing about him anymore, we wanted them to travel around the world looking for someone to take them in and perhaps help them get back their former glory. Or perhaps this guest is the former court physician of a neighboring realm, and you can see that they accidentally killed someone with a botched treatment and the scars they carry from a subsequent imprisonment. In other words, they make the world a bit more realistic, with persistent stories and the people bearing them traveling around. Is all of these enough to recreate the world of the Middle Ages in its entirety? Of course not. Many compromises had to be made, some for lack of time and human resources, many due to the limitations of the technological means, others were required by the nature itself of the video game as an entity. The great absent is, of course, the masses. In a game that simulates the life of a ruler, the recreation of the whole mass of the commoners wasn't technically possible, nor particularly engaging for the player and therefore desirable. This means that several dynamic mechanisms of society and human networks are either cut out or needed to be sublimated into extremely artificial and gamified systems. Among those, we can mention the spread and evolution of languages, cultures, religions, and innovations, but also popular happiness, level of well-beings and rebellions, and finally trade and local economy. Of course, this is not too hard a trade-off for a game that mainly deals with the historical world it represents through the filter of a map and the gamified version of, well, what we used to call spreadsheets. Actually, the distant perspective itself allows most of these phenomena even to be represented at all. An RPG like the excellent Kingdom Come Deliverance can give the player an accurate, as in detail, not necessarily judging how historically accurate, but I got the impression accurate enough, but an accurate picture of a particular place at a specific time, but by its own nature, it could never account for wide range phenomena, such as the gradual spread of the conqueror's language and culture in a conquerant land through the centuries. At this point, is a simplified, gamified representation of way too complex historical mechanisms really worse than a representation at all? Therefore, on one side of the scale, we have historical phenomena that are well known and studied, but too wide, too broad for a game. On the opposite side, we have what is too small to be historically relevant, but must have existed in a smaller familiar dimension that is much easier to handle for the video game media, but lacks easily available sources to reference. In a game such as CK3, where the focus is firmly on the interaction of the individual characters, a more domestic, day-by-day dimension is created through events. Events are pop-up windows of a narrative nature that engage the players in smaller stories of everyday life, with choices that influence either the character's life or the gameplay. Anecdotes are, in this case, the developer's best friend, because history is crazier and funnier than most people give it credit for. However, funny anecdotes are not enough to reconstruct the variety of existence, of human experience, all the possibilities of everyday interactions and connections between living people in a living world. And while the devil is indeed in the details, and it is painfully common to need to go back on a written text to change the type of a goblet that we mentioned and wasn't actually used in a particular area, or the name of a fruit that was not imported yet, and yes, these things happen, there is one thing that we can always trust: human nature. And that is precisely the dimension in which most everyday interactions occur. In my opinion, this has two advantages. First, it allows the player to empathize with their character more quickly. And secondly, it contributes at least a bit to a campaign that I've strongly felt for years, back when I was a scholar myself. So dispelling the common assumption that people in the past were this mystical race of humans, completely incomprehensible to us, with incompatible values and utterly different from us. Humans are humans are humans, have been such throughout history. While some values and beliefs might have changed, and humans in the past certainly had different values and beliefs. They certainly had a higher tolerance for blood and violence than what we currently have. Uh, being, exposed more first hand to them than what most people actually do nowadays. At the end of the day, we are all humans with the same human emotions. We all root for Achilles or Hector in the Iliad, and the earliest attested love poetry still brings a tear to our eyes. Comedies are still funny, whether they were composed yesterday in the 16th century or the 5th century BC. And we even leave the same dumb graffiti that our ancestors left in Pompeii. Therefore, there is a gold mine of human experiences that transcend time periods and significantly contributes to the perception of the game as a truly living, interconnected, realistic world. Just like all humans, our medieval characters fall in love, cheat on each other, confide in their friends, mourn their loved ones, keep compromising secrets from each other, have their rivals assassinated. Okay, maybe this one was not a good example. Anyway, moving on. Gamified mechanisms reproduce the historical too big, and the events recreate the historical too small. Where does this leave us? Do we have this perfect medieval world in miniature? Certainly not. We have spoken of technical limitations, but our last foe is still to come. Some limitations are just intrinsic to the nature of the means. A video game must be First and foremost, fun to play, which means that great agency should always be in the hands of the player. An interactive map like this one, on which to command their faithful troops, would have come pretty handy to medieval rulers, but it was something they could have hardly even imagined. This point always needs to be carefully considered when discussing historical realism in a video game. Another example is that the player needs to be, to a certain degree, omniscient. Save for a certain level of randomness, no player likes to make decisions without knowing their immediate consequences. However, that's one of the staples of human experience in dealing with others. This is the other side of the coin of characters' opinions. Sure, everyone has an opinion of everyone else, but the player sees them all. How much easier would it be to deal with other people if we could see exactly what they think of us at any time? We could sum up the main issues discussed so far as finding a delicate balance between historical accuracy, playability, and fun. When playability and fun are the staples of the video game industry, at the third pole mixes things up and makes them all the more challenging. More challenging, however, doesn't mean impossible or undesirable. Actually, it means exciting new challenges and new possibilities. For far too long, Hollywood standards have influenced us all into thinking that historical accuracy is incompatible with enjoyable and immersive experiences. And the past is just a gold mine of ideas that can only be transmitted through extreme simplifications, modernization, and stereotyping. This is now a structural part of the production and fruition of historical entertainment. The entertainment industry produces stereotypes to satisfy the consumer's expectations, and at the same time engenders the expectations themselves by teaching the consumers what to expect on a particular topic. Many factors influence the establishment of this vicious cycle, including political uses of the past. But what we set out to discuss here today is how to move away from this model rather than what caused it in the first place. Is injecting more historical accuracy, or more history, generally speaking, into entertainment media really detrimental to their enjoyability? This question has plagued me for years. As a growing historian, I found great pleasure in strategy games that allowed me to take the reins of a historical character or people and do better than history. To this aim, a certain degree of historical accuracy is strictly necessary. One can't do better than history if not facing structurally similar challenges to their historical counterparts. While I loved every fragment of these that I could find, this approach rarely went beyond strategy games, and even there was often quite underwhelming. So, for instance, an example of this changing tendency, imagine how pleasantly mind-blown I was when I first started Assassin's Creed 2 after visiting Florence with my mother and a school trip to Venice. For the first time, they were all there. The same buildings I had seen, the bridges, the churches, the towers. The cities could have looked generic and stereotypical like they always did, and mostly they still did, mind it. But the research effort that went into making them accurate and historical enough in such a big production that could have easily done without them made this game a cornerstone in my gaming life. This same mindset has informed my early interactions with Paradox Games. I searched for history in them, and while not always completely satisfied, I found it more often than in other games. Years later, I faced my interviewers with that same question. Is injecting more historical accuracy into entertainment media really detrimental to their enjoyability? I firmly believe not. So, is it possible to disseminate historical knowledge through games without making them any less fun? I set out to discover it through my direct experience. Now, to share what I've learned of how Paradox Interactive has faced a dilemma, what we do, what we can do, what we are sorely missing. So let's take a peek under the hood of a game and how a game is made. The first thing we find is that despite a common belief that games are made by coders while designers siphon all the company money to only write useless garbage that no one wanted or asked them for, there is a dedicated team of designers that are deeply involved in getting history just right. Starting from pre-production, when a game or an expansion is little more than an idea, the designers create databases of relevant historical characters and items, collect historical events for inspiration, search for images and descriptions that the artist will use as a reference for illustrations and 3D models, because yes, we have 3D models now. And start looking into board dynamics, political and social structures, trying to translate them into possible, doable, and effective gameplay mechanics. Some of us have an academic background. Others come from entirely different life paths, but are still driven by the great passion for history. Personal specific interests and background are something on which we primarily rely. One can be known as the final authority on anything Indian. Another is very passionate about the Balkans. One is a historian of the classical world. Another is a Spanish historian. Of course, the timeline of game production is cruel, so there is no time to research matters in proper depth in most cases. Hurry and the occasional lack of critical sources or means of interpretations are bound to generate errors. But the collective efforts of the team and the healthy practices of reciprocal feedback can do much to mitigate those effects, or at least they have done so far. Personally, I was fondly face palming whenever I came across some very roughly, I'm not saying painfully, translated names of settlement and the characters in both Greek and Latin, and well, let's call those Greek and Latin for lack of proper terms, back in my Imperator Rome days. Anyway, the title of a mortal enemy of designers dealing with history, all capital, goes to another problem. More often than not, despite being able to identify the technical knowledge that we need, we simply don't have access to it. The company is willing to shoulder some expenses to buy books that are used for work, and the recent politics adopted by JSTOR to allow 100 articles for free to each user during the pandemics could only mitigate our difficulties. A tremendous amount of knowledge is still carefully hidden behind the paywall of academic nature. A bit like the mistreated category of independent researchers, we lack the support of a university's subscriptions and specialized library, which only encourage us to search for answers everywhere they are available, often with no real possibility to verify them. Personally, I have used and abused the help of some friends that are still in academia. And that's a self-inflicted course of our games, is that, for instance, every tiny region needs a name, but the actual geography of vast areas could be basically unknown for centuries of our history. So it's not uncommon that we ended up assigning the name of 20th century settlements to poor, unsuspecting Hellenistic or medieval villages, sometimes by honest mistake, sometimes out of sheer desperation. As a totally personal position, I've preferred to assign the modern name of an archaeological excavation to the corresponding settlement, the ancient name of which is unknown, rather than time appropriate but completely invented and not founded names. One more scientifically accurate, it has caused an equally ahistorical proliferation of, for example, Arabic names in Hellenistic Egypt and the Near East. So what was the right solution? I don't know. Of course, the very down-to-earth or even quirky kind of information that we need often leads us to undertake some bizarre research. I remember pretty fondly some hours spent discussing the actual spread of donkey cavalry in the early Hellenistic period with the Imperator Rome team, or lengthy research on ways that the elephants, largely used by Alexander's successors, were captured and transported to the Mediterranean. And just to have someone on the forum come at me aggressively saying that actually, no, that's not true, because elephants were never transported by boats before, I don't even remember, but like centuries later. And I was like, yeah, I've done a pretty thorough research, so, you know, I'm a classicist, I'm quite familiar with these kind of sources. I know what I found, but never mind. My manager, Henrik Lomander, who spent a good deal of time on Europa Universalis, remembers instead the time and effort that went into researching this tiny pirate state of Ethiopian origin on the West Indian coastline. Whoever you may ask has an absolute trove of bizarre rabbit holes they fell into when researching. The internet itself, however, doesn't hold all the answers, as I probably don't need to explain to fellow academics, and general public assumptions can trick us when doing our research, or penalize us when we actually manage to find real results, and going therefore any deeper than these general public assumptions. There is a somewhat uncomfortably thin line between we did all the research, this is historical, our history buff players will be happy, the others will be educated on one side, and immediately finding out that the players are rioting because we removed X from the Middle Ages, and everyone knows that it was the most typical thing of the Middle Ages. This directly ties us to another topic. One of these general assumptions is that the Middle Ages were a dark, grim, brutal period of human history. This extremely austere aura clashes violently with the pettiness of our characters' problems and the light, joking tone that permeates much of our content, insomuch as that we have been repeatedly accused of promoting meme culture rather than historical representation. Now, whether meme events proper have gone too far lately or not is an internal issue that is up to debate, and we are debating it, but it transcends the point of this presentation. What is relevant to the current discussion is that the lighter, joking, or plainly petty tone of many events is just a part of human experience today, as in the Middle Ages. People joked with friends, enacted petty vendettas against their rivals, cheated on their partners, and were tricked by swindlers, and so on. We have already talked about it while I was showing some of the events from our game. On another level, the lighter tone is a sort of protective filter for the player. While not all grim and dark, the Middle Ages had a darker side that is not historically appropriate to the late completely, but could also be a bit too brutal for modern generic audiences. So let us move back to our previous topic. How do we interact with history? Another source of knowledge we largely depend on is our community of trusted betas. For those who are less familiar with game industry slang, betas are external, non-professional testers. They are among our most faithful and most devoted fans and dedicate a bit of their free time to giving feedback on early versions of the game and helping us out with ideas and research. Among them, we have academic historians, independent researchers, and all around the history buffs that animate a lovely chat with historical and game-based debates. And finally, our players are often harsh judges of our historical reconstructions. While not always the friendliest environment, the game forums are very active furnaces of feedback, sources, and knowledge sharing that our trusted QAs and the community managers scour thoroughly every day. Most complaints and suggestions are examined at some point by a designer. Sometimes they turn out to be extremely misguided, but in any case, they really give us an end. So it is clear from this survey that the relationship between game developers and academia is spotty at best. It largely depends on the chance of getting an academic involved through some collateral path, as a developer, as a friend, as a beta, as a player. However, there is no specific direct communication channel. Having been in academia myself for about 10 years, I know very well that there is still widespread snobism among academics against video games. I remember all too well my peers, so we are talking of people in their 20s, early 30s, not of ancient academic barons, priding themselves on not having ever touched a controller in their lives, as if it were something dirty or somehow disgraceful to be involved in those video games. Of course, something is moving. This workshop itself and all its participants are a clear sign that doors are slowly opening and mutual interest is growing. I already took part in a small conference about history and video games, even during my academic years, a bunch of years ago. And one of the speakers was a historian who was collaborating with Paradox on Crusader Kings 2, and should be here too, by the way. And for the first time in my life, I seriously considered a hope for a boring historian like myself to find a niche in video games. Smaller specialized conferences, workshops, and even the occasional undergraduate class are popping up with increasing frequency. However, the presence of these topics in the big arenas of the intellectual discourse is still rare and mostly met with the same amused dismissal of curiosity, not as a matter of any relevance or dignity. What shall we do then? Well, if I had an answer in my pocket, none of us would be here for this workshop. But I'm really looking forward to hearing your ideas, and I hope that you found this paper ripe with suggestions and starting points to facilitate an intense and profuse debate. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Claudia, for a very fascinating and interesting discussion. Yeah, if everyone join me in thanking either in the chat or on screen there. And that, I'd like to open the questions.